You guys have given your thoughts, and now I'm gonna
go ahead, Pete.
So, as someone who has had absolutely no experience with Devil May Cry before this anime, series, whatever you want to call it, it's shit. Even as someone who liked seasons 1 and 2 of Castlevania, I think it's shit. To the question of like, if this would even like attract normies to Devil May Cry, I think it's possible, but I agree with you that, and I say this because even after having watched the first 2 seasons of the Castlevania anime, I didn't even really want to watch, I didn't really want to, like, play the I was not enticed to play Castlevania. Granted, it's probably, like, a different kind of situation, Castlevania compared to Devil May Cry.
You would think that in a broad sense, people would be interested after seeing the first 2 seasons, right?
Here's the thing, too, and again, the one thing that I've wanted to talk about for a bit is just the general feel that, like, because a lot of people... It comes up all the time when you get bad adaptations, or even just adaptations in general, is when people talk about the media in question being bad because it is an inaccurate adaptation rather than that it is just bad on its own. And because I can understand people being upset when you want to make a drastic change to something, or you want to add something in that maybe seems like incredibly out of left field. Like, yeah, making a Devil May Cry series where the theme is like the war on terror, I can understand that, that's something that, without the experience that I've had in Devil May Cry, I can understand that is something that is very out of left field. I am not against out of left field ideas from being implemented into stories, and I'll tell you why. It's because my favorite movie was an adaptation of a book that made an incredibly drastic change to it. So my favorite movie is The Prestige, directed by Christopher Nolan, based off of the book under the same name, written by Christopher Priest. Now,
my favorite is Shining. Similar deal there.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorites.
So, The Prestige, I won't go too much into it. It's about 2 competing magicians with one another. Not like super magic, like, illusory, like, magicians. They use trickery and, traditional real-life magic. And that's the whole story, is just the rivalry between the 2. Now, in the book, half of it is from one of the magician's perspective, and then the other half is from the others. You never really get the perspective that either of them is necessarily a bad guy. They're 2 people who just don't have the full picture and were... unfortunately, just got into these different circumstances that started off this whole rivalry between the 2 of them. There's even a part in the book when they're like, if things have gone, slightly differently, we could have been friends. In the movie, it takes one of these 2 characters, Angier, and makes him into an irredeemable villain. And to give you, like, an idea of how big a change that is, if that's not enough to convince you, imagine an adaptation of Phoenix Wright, of Ace Attorney. To my understanding, Edgeworth is an antagonist, but he's not necessarily a bad person. He's just, the prosecutor. Imagine an adaptation of Ace Attorney.
Yeah, because, like, antagonist in, like, the broad sense does not mean your character's evil. Like, for example, the hero could be the antagonist to a villain protagonist.
Yeah, an antagonist and a villain are 2 entirely different things. You can have a villain who can be the protagonist, but you can also have an antagonist who isn't necessarily a villain. And, like, that's basically the equivalent of, like, this change in The Prestige, is if you took Edgeworth and you just made him into an irredeemable villain who was supposed to lose and he was just, undeniably bad. That's how big this change was in Christopher Nolan's adaptation of The Prestige. And, in any other kind of situation, people would probably question it. Here's the thing. Christopher Priest saw Nolan's take on his work and how much was changed from it. Yeah, no, it's Christopher Priest and Christopher Nolan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, both are, both their names are Chris. I know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Everybody hates.
Well, Christopher Priest loved Nolan's take on his book, despite how drastically different it was. And that's because at the heart of The Prestige It wasn't about Angier. It wasn't about Borden. It wasn't about their rivalry. It wasn't even about magic, per se. It was about demonstrating how a magic act is, in many ways, how a author presents their story, and essentially showing a story that both showcases illusory magic in the story as a parallel to the way that it is telling that story, to show you how the way that an author weaves a narrative is in many ways akin to how a magician weaves and makes a show for everyone to enjoy. That is the core of the Prestige, and how they both use trickery and misdirection to make people think one thing in order for them to have this reveal at the end. And that is what the Prestige captures. That is the core of the Prestige. And despite how differently the movie is from the book, it captures that. And that is why it's a fantastic movie. And that's also why the author of the book thought that the movie was fantastic. It's the reason why Christopher Nolan wanted to make an adaptation of the book, because he was enthralled by that. Is that it doesn't matter how much you change what you're adapting, so long as you know what the core of what you're adapting is about, and you are capable of adapting that. I genuinely believe you can change whatever the hell you want, and so long as it's still good, it will work. The question remains, is what they adapted in Netflix's Devil May Cry the core of Devil May Cry? And I can't say for certain because I'm not a Devil May Cry fan.
No.
But we can, and we say no.
Exactly.
And
listen,
there are
Devil May Cry
adaptations
fans.
that don't try to be as drastic, but still try to make their own changes to maybe eke out a bit more of what they want, what they think the core ideas are from the story and from core character relationships. Like Blaze Blue's terrible anime adaptation. It, for the most part, did a really bad job of it, even though there's actually one thing that kind of gets in a legitimately good and interesting and additive direction. But it tried to do that stuff. It didn't have time. It did a terrible job. But even that's nowhere near as dramatic as this, and it's a significantly worse show by most metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This show tried to do so much more heady and different things. The problem is the script is really subpar for the most part, filled with so many contradictions, holes, and contrivances, and the character writing is dog water.
It's either bare bones or bad. Yeah,
and so little of the appeal and core principles, in tone or anything about Devil May Cry is preserved whatsoever beyond Dante himself to a degree.
Yeah.
And if that's the most you got, the main character
it's not worth it.
Is a little like what he is in the games. That's that's not much. You better have a damn good script, and as we've demonstrated, this doesn't. So it's a failure of an adaptation and a failure of a show.
Yep.
Right.
So
I would have to agree. And just to move with Pete, right, is that there's nothing wrong with being different, right? But when you're so radically different from what the core of the work is. Because when it comes to adaptations, there are some adaptations that change small details or change a few things, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. But this show fundamentally it doesn't have the spirit of Devil May Cry. It just has the skin suit of it, and I think that's really that is the nail in the coffin. This is
Devil May Cry in blackface.
This is the second time this has happened with an American take on Devil May Cry.
Yeah.
It's not much better than the first time.
Yeah.
We should probably just not let this happen again after season 2 comes out.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't colonize everything, guys. Maybe
The Americans can't handle that. Just like how the Americans ruined Black Mirror.
So